45 years have passed since an infamous race at Europe's Cathedral of Speed changed F1 safety forever. Okay, that's a overused phrase, but I'm going to keep running with it. It's also been 45 years since one of F1's brightest was taken too soon, and many say that he would have probably been a world champion if not for this accident. 1978 is the year, and the event is the 1978 Italian Grand Prix. The Italian Grand Prix was pretty late in the 1978 season, owing to the fact that this time the vast majority of racing in Formula 1 was done in Europe. The opening 4 races of the 16-race season were flyaway races in Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, and the Long Beach circuit in California, before 10 races in a row in Europe, which led into 2 more flyaway races at Watkins Glen and then the Canadian Grand Prix at Montreal. A season that ran from the 15th of January to the 8th of October. Such was the nature of the calendar, there was a gap of over a month between the Brazilian and South African Grand Prix. And now we have F1 content creators crying that they've got to wait 2 weeks for a race. 1978 was also the start of teams starting to bring their ground effect cars into the sport off the back of what Lotus was achieving with the Lotus 78. Brabham had brought the fan car, a car that managed to dodge a rule regarding active aero through Gordon Murray proving to the FIA that the fan did more to cool the engine than it did to suck the car to the ground. Bernie Eccleston, the owner of Brabham at the time, voluntarily withdrew the car after it won the Swedish Grand Prix, because he needed to keep the independent teams on his side with the Formula 1 Constructors Association, which was facing off against the manufacturer teams that they thought were being biased towards. But it was clear to see that Lotus had got the car by which all others were measured, at least when the 79 was introduced at the Belgian Grand Prix. Mario Andretti won the season opener at Buenos Aires, but the only other win that car would get would be Ronnie Peterson's win at South Africa. The other results while that car was in service, well, they weren't exactly great. But once the 79 came in, it was the domination you'd expect. I mean, when it worked, obviously. Also during this year, Bernie Eccleston had been for a medical where he'd met this doctor in London. This doctor had once upon a time been working for his dad in a garage in Liverpool before deciding he wanted to enter the medical profession, graduating from the University of Liverpool in 1956 before doing a bit of racing and some military service. In 1958 he moved to Oxford to specialise in neurosurgery before becoming the head of neurosurgery at the Royal London Hospital in 1970. So this guy was very good at his job and was interested in motorsport. So Bernie offered him £35,000 for the year to be Formula 1's official race doctor, starting from the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix. That doctor was Eric Watkins, better known as Professor Sid to everybody. Needless to say, this new doctor wasn't particularly well liked by the circuit owners. Jackie Stewart must have sent him a few "now you know how it feels" letters. Sid had been appointed the head doctor at the RAC Medical Committee in 1970 and worked the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. When he turned up, he found things to be primitive at best and noticed that there was scope for improvement. It was here that he said, "Look, why don't we set things up so that if there is a massive accident, we have everything needed to treat the driver here, instead of sending them by road to Sevenoaks, Maidstone, London or wherever," drawing on the fact that just 12 months prior Graham Hill had broken both of his legs at Watkins Glen and had been taken many miles by road to a hospital that had closed down. Coincidentally, Watkins was working in New York at that same time. The response? Why should racing drivers get more in the way of medical care than the average person on the road? So when Watkins turned up to his first race at the Swedish Grand Prix, the medical centre was a caravan with a tent to act as overflow. At Brands Hatch, the medical centre was under the grandstand on the main straight, which would have required taking an injured driver down a flight of stairs. Suboptimal doesn't really begin to describe it. The circuit owners all thought that Sid was there to tell them what to do. They thought it was going to be another Jackie Stewart situation. This Sid bloke's going to be costing us a lot of money. But Bernie wasn't messing around. Sid was there to do some serious work because in the run-up to the 1978 season, 11 drivers had been killed, and with Formula 1 now becoming more and more of a TV and commercial success, dead drivers are bad for business. Such was Bernie's seriousness, at the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim, Sid had been denied entry to race control. Given that Sid was the official F1 doctor, Bernie was pretty upset that this was the case, and threatened the race organisers with going down to the grid where all the cars were assembled and telling them to get off the grid and pack up. "What are we going to do with 80,000 fans?" they asked. "Tell them to fuck themselves," Bernie replied. They then allowed Sid to do his job. So fast forward to Monza. This would be Sid's 7th race as the official race doctor, and a race that would result in many changes, which are still in place today. Andretti entered the race 12 points in the lead from Peterson, while Lauda in the Brabham was 3rd, 28 points behind. Lauda was out of contention, so it was just between the two Lotus drivers. Andretti would put his car on pole, 0.3 of a second ahead of Gilles Villeneuve's Ferrari. Peterson would be in 5th, about 0.7 off Andretti, and was having to drive the older 78 because his 79 was constantly suffering from mechanical gremlins. A bad start would mean Peterson getting caught in some sort of melee at the first chicane. Well, chicanes, there was 2 of them. The cars did their formation lap, and while the leaders were starting to pull up to the line, for whatever reason the starter, a man called Gianni Restelli, had signalled the green lights while the cars were lining up. There's footage in the documentary called Life on the Limit that shows that Andretti and Villeneuve hadn't even stopped rolling when the lights went green. Peterson is jumped by at least 4 cars, and then you see Hunt's McLaren clip Peterson's Lotus as an Arrows driven by Riccardo Patrese goes to the right of Hunt, and Hunt swerves to avoid him. Peterson, Hunt, Vittorio Brambilla, Hans Stuck, Patrick Depailler, Didier Pironi, Derek Daly, Clay Regazzoni and Brett Lunger were all involved, with Peterson's Lotus catching fire on the right hand side of the track. Hunt, Regazzoni and Depailler all jumped out of their cars to rescue the Super Swede from that burning Lotus, much like Lauda was rescued from his burning Ferrari at the Nürburgring 2 years prior. Peterson's legs were badly broken, but he was still alert and talking. Brambilla had been struck in the head by a tyre and was out cold. So as you can imagine, this was Watkins' cue to get to the scene and start doing his job, but he didn't have a car to get him there, so he had to go on foot. When he eventually got to the crash site, the Italian police had already set up a cordon and were not letting anybody through, because for 1, he wasn't in a car, 2, he was employed by FOCA and not by the FIA, and 3, if there was a death, this accident became a crime scene. So they wanted to preserve evidence. So Sid had no choice but to turn around, walk back to the pits, and then receive Ronnie at the medical centre. 20 minutes later. He was conscious and rational, Watkins described. We put a splint in his legs and put a drip up. That was all done correctly, but there was no crowd control. While I was working on Ronnie, a photographer pointed a camera between my legs to get a picture of him. So I kicked him. Peterson had 27 fractures in both legs, and at the hospital the doctors didn't know if they should do all of them in one go or not. During the night, Peterson developed a fat embolism, which is where fat enters the bloodstream due to the breaking of a bone. Now, according to sources, if a bone is immobilized conservatively, then the chances of developing one of these fat embolisms are in the 22% range. In an old Autosport article, it appears that the doctors had pinned the bones of his legs while the circulation hadn't been stabilized properly, or something to that effect. I mean, I'm not a doctor. Either way, during the night, Peterson's condition worsened, and then his kidneys failed, and he died. Andretti's single point from the race was enough to win him the championship, but the celebrations were muted. Andretti's championship win was very similar to the way Phil Hill had won his championship, both racing under the American flag, both at Monza, and both won the championship at a race where their talented teammates had been killed. So things started to take a turn. Drivers turned around and immediately pointed the fingers at one Riccardo Patrese, the driver who was to take the blame for the accident, mostly from James Hunt. Patrese was coming to the end of his second season, and had been involved in a few accidents that season where some had suggested that they'd been caused through driving a bit too aggressively or without due care and attention. Patrese claimed he'd been ahead of Hunt when the accident happened, but 5 drivers put the pressure on hard, knowing that the FIA wasn't really going to do anything about it. Hunt, Lauda, Fittipaldi, Scheckter and Andretti said they were not going to race at the next round at Watkins Glen if Patrese was there. Given that the 5 of them had 6, later 8 championships between them, their collective voice was a lot louder than anyone or anything else in the sport. And despite Patrese hiring a lawyer to try and put a stop to this kangaroo court, his team, Arrows, quietly withdrew him from the next race, because they were a new team to the sport and had to play the political long game. Patrese was later acquitted by the Italian courts 4 years later. It turned out his car was ahead of Hunt and Peterson when the accident happened. Hunt would still accuse Patrese of causing the death of Peterson until his last breath. Andretti would later call the accusations lobbied at the then 24-year-old the most shameful moment of his racing career. Scheckter and Fittipaldi would later apologise, while Lauda stayed quiet. In terms of safety, Watkins went on the warpath. After the race in Italy, he told Bernie he needed a car, an anaesthetist, safety equipment and a helicopter, and he got them for the next race. Watkins would also be in that car for the formation lap and the first lap of every race in the event of an accident, and then the car would be at the end of the pit lane ready to go at less than a second's notice. He also wrote the template of what every circuit should have in terms of medical facilities. They had to be secure, within easy reach of a helicopter, and that fully trained fire marshals should be putting out fires instead of yanking potentially injured drivers from them. A practice that came in clutch when Gerhard Berger had his fiery accident at Imola in 1989. And Sid didn't really care for the feelings of circuit owners or team owners. Following the deaths of Ratzenberger and Senna in 1994, Sid and the FIA borrowed a chassis off McLaren and ran some tests that led to the high cockpit size for 1996. All of the teams except Ferrari complained about this change, with one team principal saying that the redesign was going to cost them X amount of pounds to do. Sid simply said, "We'll knock it off the driver's salary. It's for him, not me." Following Mika Häkkinen's accident at Adelaide in 1995, I think those team principals would have stopped crying. And Sid would be the only person who Bernie would listen to. In 1987, Nelson Piquet had been involved in an accident at Imola and had been declared unfit to race. Bernie tried to convince Watkins that everything was fine and Nelson should be allowed on track to do a few laps in practice. Sid simply told him, "If Nelson drives, I'm gone and I'm not coming back." Piquet never did those laps. There were some drivers that Watkins was not able to save, and those drivers are on your screen right now. But following the events of the 1978 Italian Grand Prix, changes implemented by Sid and then accelerated by Max Mosley, the list of those drivers that he was able to save, directly and indirectly, is much, much longer. That's a lot of names that would have probably died if they'd had those same accidents 40 or 50 years ago. So then, a look at the 1978 Italian Grand Prix, the Kangaroo Court, and how it started the Professor Sid revolution that took what Jackie Stewart had started and turned it up to 11. If you've learned something new here today, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, subscribe and get the bell on so you never miss out. Many thanks to the kind folk at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help out with keeping things running around here, there's a link in the description to Patreon, along with links to Discord, socials, the F1 Store affiliate, and there's other bits and pieces there too. Well, there's super thanks if you think this video was super, much like Sid was. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.